Let's get to know you a little bit. So tell us about Yoni, who Yoni is. Start with where you grew up and your early life experience is what I'm curious about.
Yeah. This is the therapy session, right? This is the
therapy session, my favorite.
I've been waiting for. I've needed a therapy session all week, so this is coming at a great time. Thanks, Nick. So I hope my accent still comes through. I grew up in Australia. I'm Australian born and have an Israeli father, an Australian mother, and yeah, that was my early life. Well, until I was 27. So still at this point, still the majority of my life, or 2/3 of it at least, was spent in Australia.
So what's it like growing up in Australia? Is it like running around and playing games with kangaroos and having boxing match with those kangaroos? So what is that like?
Yeah, that was my childhood. I had a kangaroo in the backyard. We used to box a couple times a week, and yeah, Joey, his name was. No, I grew up in the city. I grew up in Melbourne. It's 4 million, population of 4 million in Melbourne. And I would say, I've lived in Tel Aviv, I've lived in Los Angeles. So I've got a little bit of perspective now in terms of the differences. Listen, it was, somewhat suburbia, just on the edge of the city. It's a big city. There's a lot of activity. It's very exciting place. And I think culturally, I am Australian, and it's definitely the culture that feels that it's very laid back. Obviously there's a degree of seriousness, but I don't think anyone takes themselves too seriously. And I think that is something that, the rest of the world can learn, particularly Americans can learn from the Aussie culture.
Well, yeah, it's the environment is very important. So, you and I had a couple of discussions about how the environment affects people's psyche. So growing up, when was the first time you realized you had interest in business, money, or selling something? I've heard all kinds of things that motivate people to do this at a very young age.
Yeah, I wasn't one of those guys or girls for that matter. I wasn't one of those people that, I can say at 3 years old, I was selling my pencils to the kid next door to me. Like that wasn't me. I was always very curious in nature. And I think that probably it started for me when I started making my first real money. When I was in college, and on the back of that experience, I think, I had a bit of exposure, and I actually fell in love with marketing, with digital marketing. That was something that I felt really passionate about. So yeah, I would say that I was working as a recruiter. It was my first job out of college, and there was probably 15 other businesses in this somewhat co-working incubator space. And I saw these guys building websites like old school. This is going back to sort of 2008, maybe. And yeah, I just would walk past and gravitate toward the whole experience. And I left a paying job to take an unpaid internship and start working at a digital agency. I just really had a passion for it.
So this was an incubator that where other people trying to build businesses, and that's where you interned?
I interned at an agency in Australia. I was paid at this recruitment firm that was partly owned by, it wasn't a conglomerate. It was a couple of guys who had invested in sort of 20 different businesses. So they just brought all of the businesses into one office space back then.
Well, did they have a hands-on or hands-off approach?
They were very hands-on. They were very hands-on as a business. Yeah.
So, and you were working in one of the companies that was in that kind, the agency.
I was working at a recruitment company in that environment, and ultimately left to go for a completely unrelated business, and took an unpaid internship just so that I could get exposure into working in the field.
I see.